From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for coming. I'm Mary Jane Deeb, Chief of the African and Middle East Division, and I'm happy to see you all here. Today's program is the first this fall in the ongoing library series entitled Conversations with African Poets and Writers, and this particular program is the 24th in the series. In October 2011, the Africa section of the African Middle East Division, in partnership with the Poetry and Literature Center, headed by Rob Casper, who is represented today by Anya Cretney, who will be speaking, and in partnership with the Africa Society of the National Summit on Africa, which was then headed by Bernadette Paulo, and is now headed by Patricia Bain, who will be speaking too, she's the president, and by Ambassador Pamela Bridgewater, who's here with us, the chairman of the society. Well, those three organizations launched a new program here at the Library of Congress, consisting of conversations and interviews with established and emerging poets, short story writers, novelists, and playwrights of continental and diasporic Africa. 4 years later, the series has become well-known and well-established and has brought to the library and to our patrons and readers, as well as to all those who access the library's webcasts around the world, some of the best writers from Africa. From those who are no longer with us, like Chinua Achebe and Ali Mazrui, to poets like the poet laureate of South Africa, Kearapetsi Kego Sitsil, to the new generation of writers like Amadou Kon from the Côte d'Ivoire, Nigerian writer Igoni Barrett, the poet Omikongo Dibanga from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, to Tijan Salah, a Gambian poet. We brought many, many people to this series. Last year, we even hosted Laman Cisse, who became the new Chancellor of the University of Manchester. And today, we have Shenaz Patel, who is the first Mauritian writer in this series. She's here thanks to the International Writers Program at the University of Iowa and the Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs of the Department of State. And I thank you all for bringing such a wonderful writer to us. And before we start the program, I would like to introduce the president of our partner organization, the Africa Society of the National Summit on Africa, Patricia Bain, who will make some remarks, after which Anya Cretney, who is representing the Poetry and Literature Center, will introduce the speaker. Eve Ferguson, the Africa reference librarian, will then conduct the conversations. So without further ado, Patricia, thank you.
Welcome to Conversations with African Poets and Writers. Good afternoon. My name is Patricia Bain. I'm the president of the Africa Society, here, as Dr. Deeb said, with my chairman, Ambassador Pamela Bridgewater, and Ms. Sarah Caruso, right in the back of her. Thank you, Mary Jane Deeb, Dr. Casper, who's not here, everybody associated with the Library of Congress. For this iteration of African poets and writers, I want to especially thank you, Mary Jane, for being an extraordinary partner in this series. This is the 24th, it's very exciting. The Africa Society's partnership with the African section of the Africa and Middle Eastern Division and the Poetry and Literature Center of the Library of Congress, in our view, is the perfect marriage, because we both provide a platform for African literary figures accessible to everyone throughout the world who would not have the privilege of meeting them but for this forum. And today we have the pleasure of an exceptional author, our first from Mauritius, Ms. Shenaz Patel, who is really also a playwright, a journalist, social and cultural issues promoter and advocate. You do a lot, Ms. Patel. You're an impressive literary and cultural ambassador from Mauritius. And having you with us today makes us cognizant of the myriad of languages and cultures that are spoken in the 55 countries of the African continent, and the fact that the prowess of African writers is really felt in countries all over the world. With you and with all our previous guests, we learn more about different African countries, the different voices, and we grow from what we learn, as does our audience. And so we're very pleased to have you in our midst today. And now I will call on Tanya.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you, Patricia, and thanks to both the Africa Society of the National Summit on Africa and the African and Middle Eastern Division here at the Library of Congress. My name is Anya Kreitney, and I'm the program specialist of the Poetry and Literature Center here at the library. I'm also a proud partner in this series, representing and celebrating literature from across the African continent. I am thrilled and delighted to welcome the International Writers Program at the University of Iowa back to the Library of Congress, and especially pleased to welcome writer Shenaz Patel to the Conversations with African Writers, Poets and Writers series. The International Writers Program is a unique conduit connecting established writers from around the globe to other cultures via reading tours, classroom talks, and public lectures. Since 1967, over 1,400 writers from more than 190 countries have been in residence at the University of Iowa. Writer Shenaz Patel is one of these outstanding residents. A fiction writer and a playwright hailing from Mauritius, as has been mentioned, Ms. Patel has written 4 novels, numerous plays, and short stories in both French and Mauritian Creole. She is best known for her 2005 novel, excuse my French, Les Silences des Chagots, as close as I can get. And as a working journalist, she writes about social and cultural issues, much like Patricia has mentioned, and she's often seeking to unearth the unsaid and the untold. So I know we are all excited to hear from her today. Let me tell you just a word about the Poetry and Literature Center. We are the home of the Poet Laureate Consultant in Poetry. This year it's Juan Felipe Herrera in his second term, and we put on 30 to 40 programs just like this one a year. To find out more about our series and other programs at the Library of Congress, you can visit us at www.loc.gov/poetry, or to find out more about the Conversations with African Poets and Writers series that Mary Jane Dean was listing the various writers, please visit www.loc.gov/rr/Ahmed. And certainly, last but not least, I want to thank our presenting partners, the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs at the U.S. Department of State and the Penn Faulkner Foundation. Now, let me turn it over to Shenaz for a reading followed by a conversation with Eve. Please. Just stay sort of far away. I'm going to turn it up for you. Okay.
Good morning, everybody. I'm very happy and honored to be with you here today. It's a very special occasion for me, and I'd like to thank, in particular, the IWP for bringing me here to Washington. First to Iowa City, where we've been spending 2 months and a half now with 36 different writers from 30 different countries, and it has been such an enlightening and great experience to be able to share the literature of other countries and also share on a human point of view with so many writers, which I especially want to thank because I think they have brought a lot to my understanding of the world and my understanding of people, and all that is going to come through in the future writing, so thank you so much. I would like to read today from the novel called Les Silences des Chagots, which is a novel which was published a few years ago, but which is very, very special to my heart. For me, it's not just a novel. It's a life story. It's based on a true and tragic story. It recounts what happened to a population called the Chagosians. They lived on islands, an archipelago, the archipelago of Chagos, which initially belonged to the territory of Mauritius. Mauritius, as you know, is a small island state in the middle of the Indian Ocean. And we were formerly a British colony from 1810 to 1968, when we gained our independence. And when Mauritius asked for its independence in the 1960s, the British said, okay, we're going to give you independence, but we're just going to keep that part of your territory, the Chagos archipelago. And there was a deal between the British and the Americans who wanted this particular place, and the main island of that archipelago, which is called Diego Garcia. They wanted to establish a military base on this island because it was ideally situated in the middle of the Indian Ocean to be able to control the whole of the Middle East. And it must be known that most of the bombings that went on these last years on Afghanistan and Iraq came from the island of Diego Garcia. So the United States said that these islands are very important to maintain the security of the free world. But what is not really known is that this freedom happened at the expense of the freedom of a population, the Chagosians who were living there, and who were disposed of in terrible conditions. The British said to the Americans that first that there was no population on these islands, then they had to get rid, in a way, of these people, and this happened in two different phases. The first one, they tried to get the people away by different means. They closed the hospital, they didn't send what they needed for everyday life at first, and they tried to get them to go to Mauritius. And when they wanted to take the boat back, to go back to their islands, they were told that their islands were closed and that they weren't going back. And then the second phase, in the beginning of 1972, the Americans were getting impatient, so they just sent a boat. The people were given half an hour to collect their things and get on the boat and go away without being told what was happening to them, where they were being taken. And they were thrown in Mauritius, totally helpless and without anything. And these people have been fighting for years for the recognition of the harm that has been done to them. Mauritius has been fighting also as a state to claim its sovereignty on that territory. And 3 weeks back, our Prime Minister was at the National Assembly of the United Nations in New York to reaffirm our claim on these islands. And this is a story that struck me not for its geopolitical and historical context, but for the people who were concerned. And I met some of these people, they confided their story to me, and I really wanted to get it across, the story of how you feel when you're confronted to this in your life, how you live through that, if you can, because a lot of Chagosians didn't go through it. A lot of them committed suicide, and it was very, very hard for that population. And so I met some of them, and they confided their story to me. And this book is a way of trying to get their story across, because they didn't have a voice at that time to tell their own story. So I'm just going to read an extract from the Silence des Chagos. Charlesia was starting to be fed up with all those Mauritians who aimed to hold her back. At the hospital, the doctor had been saying for a long time now that her husband was completely recovered and he could leave. It was obvious that he was. And for that matter, she'd been sure that she could have treated him at home in Diego Garcia. A few days of Filaoti infusions to lower tension and fresh coconut milk to cleanse the system, and his symptoms would have disappeared. But the nurse over there was a scaremonger. He has to go to Mauritius. We can't take care of him anymore here. He has to seek treatment in Mauritius. That's what they wouldn't stop saying to Charlesia. Even the administrator encouraged her to leave. Go, you have to go. He'll be better cared for in Mauritius, and it will do you good. You've worked hard anyway. It's vacation season. Bring the kids, have a good time, stop worrying. She finally let them convince her, and they left on the next voyage of the Mauritius boat. They disembarked there at the end of that queue, which led to the dust-clotted noise of Port Louis, the capital city of Mauritius Island. More than a month had passed since. Her husband was fully recovered, and it was well past time to return. They'd been imposing for too long on these people with their 6 children. It wouldn't be soon till their welcome turned to vinegar. She could feel it. They had a funny way of living here, always in a rush, constantly required to stuff themselves inside the claustrophobic, harsh cities. The children were getting restless. They needed space, their space. This time, the people at the Rogers office would have to reply to her. She'd gone there twice already, asking when the next boat would depart for Chagos. She could see herself aboard, turning her back to the grey port, surrounded by those eyesore-high mountains, sea filling her lungs, a week's calm journey to the north, and then, one morning, in the slanted light of dawn, their rosary of islands, sprinkled over the water like a spray of gentle prayers, whispered, granted. Charlesia pulls a flower-embroidered handkerchief from a blouse, wipes off her forehead. She enters the office. A few ceiling fans struggle to turn their blades, creaking and wheezing under layers of dust and fossilized crud. Several men, shirt sleeves rolled up, are seated behind green formica desks, piled high with folders and dirty cups. Charlesia goes up to the person standing closest to the door. He raises his head, tosses her a brief glance. Well, look who's here. A sharp laugh lifts up through the room. Charlesia holds her ground. Mollet connaît quand bateau poilé. She's not asking them for sorcery. She simply wants to know when the next boat leaves for Chagos, her home. The fans creak a little louder. Mollet connaît. Go on, tell her. The voice comes from the back of the room. Between 2 piles of folders, another man looks at her, with something evasive in his eyes, but his voice is firm. She has to be told. An immense silence descends over Charlesia's head. It lands suddenly on her chest, which contracts, and she is powerless to control it. Another voice rises up beside her. Then tell her yourself. The man hesitates. He fidgets with his pen, twirling it between his thick fingers, his nails almost perfect squares. I'll ask the boss. His chair scrapes on the floor. He gives a discreet knock on the glass door, listens briefly, then turns the copper handle and goes in the office, carefully closing the door behind him. Charlesia sees him. He has barely moved forward in the room. Sweat has drawn brown waves at the back of his beige shirt. He speaks for a while, turning around to indicate the place where she is standing. Charlesia waits. The others have resumed work, leafing through big files, rattling away on their typewriters. The man raises his hand again, slips it in his collar, mechanically rubs his neck. Then he waves it in front of him. He seems to be insisting. Finally he nods, turns back, bends upon the handle, opens the door, closes it again cautiously. He slowly walks back to his table, sits down again. Well, asked his colleague. Well, he told me to tell her. Maybe you should take her outside. She looks like a handful, that one, he says, laughing. Charlesia feels like she's going to lose it. Are they talking about her? What is all this gossiping about? She walks up to the man. Où est quelque chose pour dire moi? He barely lifts his eyes to hers. Yes, he has something to tell her. Better get on with it. It's almost noon and he has to hurry if he doesn't want to get overtaken by the crowd at the shop where the stuffed breads await him. You won't have a return boat. He blurted out the sentence, closing his folder with a force that made the metal rings on its side clatter. Charlesia doesn't move. She was afraid for a moment that he had slammed the folder shut on his fingers. She already saw his blood-streaked flesh twitch frenetically, trying to escape the steel ring that the restless left hand couldn't manage to force open. The sound of the folder booms in her head. The clacking rings, the clamoring of the drawer. He said something to her, but she didn't understand what. She looks at him to repeat it, but he continues to shuffle through his belongings. The others get up around him. Charlesia doesn't move. She stares at the man, waiting for him to repeat his sentence. There will be no more returning ships. You'll have to stay here. Zil infermi. He spoke with a dry voice, lowered his head and arranged his last papers in a drawer that he shut carefully with a key. Charlesia hears the blades of the fan stirring the air, cutting it up and sending his words back to her. Zil enclosed. Zil enclosed. The man approaches her. Around them, the office is empty. He puts his hand firmly on her shoulder, makes her turn to the door. She's outside. He disappears. Over there, the sea calls to her. Against the current of human waves that lap toward the exit, step after step she walks to the farthest point of the queue, where she stands motionless. From his sentry box, the attendant watches her, hypnotized by that silhouette, by the red scarf prominent against the turquoise backdrop of the glittering sea. He watches this woman in front of the sea, who appears to be waiting. Waiting for what? A boat, a never-absent boat tattooed on the retina of a lookout woman. She probes the blue span, infinitely blue, but as much as she tries, she can't seem to hole through the curtain. The sea remains obstinately empty. There's no boat. There's no more boat for her. That's what they have just told her. Yet another one of their stupid jokes to pass the time. No more boat. That doesn't mean anything. This sentence has no sense. They'd better shut up rather than spurt out such insanities. Zil infermi, yeah. What's that? Your island is closed. Heck, what do they think, this bunch of simpletons? That it's a restaurant or something like their shitty office of deadbeats? Something with opening and closing hours from 9 to 4 written up on the doors? If she threw herself in the water, would the too soon gunboat come back to rescue her? Bring her back home on the other side of the sea? Charlesia steps up to the edge of the queue. The greasy harbor waters flock heavily against the concrete parapet. Over there, the horizon is a sharp, bright line. The boat has already gone over it, without her. And she asks herself where from comes that wave that rolls suddenly through her whole body. Thank you. I just wanted to say that the book is written in French and that this translation has been made by Patricia Hartland, who I especially want to thank for a very beautiful and loving work she's done on that translation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Shenaz. That was beautiful. I think I know how it ends, but I won't give it away. I did want to mention that today is rather significant, though, because yesterday marked 8 years ago that we came up with the inspiration, somewhat, for this series, and that was the celebration of the 50th anniversary of Things Fall Apart. And that was November 3rd, 2008. I can't believe it's been 8 years already, but that has passed, as has the great author Chinua Achebe. So, you know, we can kind of dedicate today's program to his memory, as he was the father of the widely read African novel. So that's a moment of remembering him and remembering what happened 8 years ago. And it's a different scenario because 8 years ago we were the day before Election Day, and now we're heading into next week, and that's all I'll say about that.
I could say
We're supposed to be nonpartisan here, so we'll just move on to literature. So my first question for you is, when did you start writing, and can you talk about the relationship between literary writing and your role as a journalist?
To say when I started writing, I have to say when I started reading, because it's so much linked for me. I had the chance to have grown up in a family who loved books. My father would go through the whole island, where people at one time were leaving Mauritius for different reasons and selling everything they owned. So people went there to buy furniture or things like that. And he went around the island and came back with big boxes of old books. And I didn't quite understand at first why he did that and why that was so important. And very quickly I wanted to be able to read by myself, to be able to understand what the treasures in these boxes he brought back home were. I became a very eager reader. I had to read, and I still had to read every day. I can stay without writing for some days, but not without reading. Because I feel like my day would be so incomplete without reading. And I think I took, in the library at school, I took from letter A to letter Z, going through all the books. And then at one point I felt like I also had stories in my head that I wanted to tell, so that's how the writing came. But it was a very, very long process from the beginning of writing to the fact of publishing, because I think it's very hard, even if you're not telling your story or your own life in the books you write, you always put a lot of yourself in what you write, and it took me a very long time to overcome that kind of shyness or timidity at the fact of showing what I wrote. And so it wasn't until I was around 30, I think, that I started publishing. But writing has always been there for me as something essential to my life, because I had the impression somewhere, the very utopic impression that writing could change the world. And so at first I was high like that, and everybody was asking me, what do you want to do afterwards when you're grown up? And I said, I want to be a journalist, because I was very struck by what I saw around me. I was very ill at ease and unhappy with a lot of situations of injustice that I could see around me, and I felt like I just couldn't do as if it had nothing to do with me. And I felt like being a journalist and writing would be able, perhaps, to change that. I have evolved from that a bit, but not totally, and that's why I'm still writing. And literature is a different kind of writing. In journalism, it's very precise, very clinical. You don't fool around. It's a very precise way of writing. Literature is my space of freedom, where I can do whatever I want. I remember a friend telling me one day I was kind of going around a bit frantically trying to fix everything that wasn't going right in the lives of people I love. And he just took me by the shoulders, he stopped me and he looked into my eyes and he said, you know, you're not God. I was very disappointed, I must say. But then I found out that in literature I could be God. I could create someone that I would like to see in my life and that I wouldn't perhaps see in my life. In my books, I could create that person. I could kill him tomorrow if I was fed up with him. I could bring him back the day after if I was missing him. So literature is my space of freedom where I can be God and change the world in a way.
Okay, excellent. You know, so Shenaz and I spoke a little bit briefly before the program, and it came to our realization we're both journalists, and it's interesting for me to find out why she started being a journalist, because it was the same reason I did. I was sitting in the middle of Uganda and Idi Amin took over, and I read things about Idi Amin, and I was like, that's not really what I'm seeing. So I thought I could change everybody's opinion by being a journalist, and I gave up on that idea too. But didn't pursue the further reading. And then the other thing is that you are a bibliophobic. I found out this new word. Bibliophobia is the fear of running out of books to read.
Yeah, that's true.
So that's a very, very useful word for people like you. In addition, I just wanted to make an aside to Chinua Achebe that I had asked him, why did he kill my favorite character in Things Fall Apart, Ikemefuna? And he said, I didn't kill Ikemefuna, Okonkwo did. And I said, but you created Okonkwo. And he said, no, once I created Okonkwo, he had his own life. So I think that, you know, when you say that you get to be God in your own writing, you know, your characters become who they want, who you want them to be, and then they take off on a life of their own.
That's true.
So my next question is, who or what are the major influences on your work?
It's difficult to say, there are so many. I love, it's a strange thing because I write in French. My two mother tongues are French and Creole, so I write in French and Mauritian Creole. I don't write in English. I don't know if I should say unfortunately, or anyway, not yet. But I find like Anglophone literature has been very, very inspiring for me. Because in Anglophone literature I find a vitality that I don't find in Francophone literature. I think there's much more freedom and inventivity with language in Anglophone literature than in French literature, well, at least what is published nowadays. And so I've read a lot of everything, and I particularly like authors like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who could create, and I was always fascinated by that, how something's totally not alive at all. It's ink on a white page, and then suddenly, just by the way you put a word here instead of here, a comma here instead of there, you create a world and you create characters who become like persons, and you feel like they're alive, and long after you've put down the book, you have the impression that these characters are walking with you and stay with you for years and years. And in Garcia Marquez, you find that he creates characters that you know wouldn't exist in real life, but in the space of the book, they are real, they are alive. And Salman Rushdie also is an author that I like a lot. Midnight's Children, for me, is one of these books that really says so much about the power of literature to create a world and to create people that go beyond what we could experience, but yet tell us so much about who we are and about our place in the world.
Great. My next question for you, why did you choose to write fiction as your creative outlet? I know you've written short stories, plays, and news articles, but also have you delved into other literary genres like poetry?
We have a discussion, it's funny that you asked the question because we have an ongoing discussion about that for the past 2 months. I've never dared poetry because I love poetry so much, and I felt like it was higher than me. But then I've been writing something since I've been here, and I've been writing in English, which for me is quite strange. And my friends on the IWP tell me, but you're writing poems, and I said, no, I'm not writing poems, I'm writing texts. But I'm always a bit surprised about all the categorization we make, if it's creative non-fiction or fictional poetry or novellas or short stories, or for me, all these are texts. And the important thing is not the genre, but the voice. What I'm looking for in the text is a voice and a story. You write if you have a story to tell, otherwise, I mean, go play football or anything else. There are so many stories around us that want to be told, and I've tried through, I like particularly the short story, because a short story for me is like that pebble that you throw in a pond. It's very compact, it goes down very quickly, but it leaves after it these ripples on the water, which are like echoes that go around you. And a good short story, when it's well written, it's exactly that. It's like throwing a pebble in a pond, and it stays with you for long afterwards. People tend to think that writing a novel is more difficult than writing a short story. I don't totally agree. It's another process, it's a longer process, but in a novel you can be less good on some things and try to make up for it on other aspects. In a short story you can't. Either it's well written and it's good, or it's not. Then theatre plays is also a very interesting field for me, because it's a place where you're in direct contact with the public, and that's very important. When you write a novel, you write it and then you don't know where it goes, you're not in contact with people who read it, but you can meet them afterwards, but it's not the same process. In the plays, the writing is directly aimed at people. So that's a very interesting thing also. I'm also interested in graphic novels, because that's another way. And in fact, I think I'm fascinated by all the different ways of telling a story. At the IWP in Iowa City, we had an interaction with some dancers from the School of Dance. And it was really fascinating to see how they took some of our texts, what they got from it, and how they told that story with their bodies. So how the stories we write can be told by others, can be received and felt by other people and told differently. And I think this is never ending.
Okay, that's really interesting to me as a writer, because I know also that it's more difficult to write a 500-word article than it is to write a 1,500-word article. So I think the parallel is there with the news stories also.
Yes, that's one of the first things my first editor-in-chief told me when I started as a young journalist. I was 19, and I wrote something, and I had been investigating on something for weeks and weeks, and I came up with so many information and material that I kind of said, can't I have 2 pages in the newspaper? And he said, no, you have just 1 page and you stick to that. And I said, there's so many things, so many information that I'll have to leave aside. And he said to me, you know, one journalist went to his editor-in-chief and gave him his article, and he said, I wrote it long, I didn't have time. So that's when we learned to make it short, and it's even harder, and it takes even more time to make it short.
Okay, having been born and raised in Mauritius, and what has Mauritian literature been like historically, and what's happening in the literary scene now?
The actual literary scene is very active, very energetic, I would say. There have been, Mauritius published the first book in the Southern Hemisphere in 18 something, at the beginning of the 19th century. And since then we have had a very lively literary scene. There have been different phases in that. At one point we had all that kind of colonial literature chanting you know, the breeze in the palm trees and the beautiful down Creole and the verandas and things like that. And in fact, Baudelaire, the great French poet Baudelaire, wrote a poem called I'm Dame Creole to a Creole woman, to a Creole lady, which was directly inspired by his stay in Mauritius when his parents were sent him away from Paris, where he was living a very, how can I say the word? Yeah, they didn't like the life he was living in Paris, the débauche, as we said, and so they were trying to send him away to India. And on his way to India, the boat stopped in Mauritius, and then he never went further. He stayed a bit in Mauritius, and then he went back to France, and he wrote these poems that are part of this famous collection called Les Fleurs du Mal. So there has been a lot of that in Mauritian literature a few years back. And then there has been a second phase where Mauritian writers felt like they had to exile themselves to be able to exist as writers, that it wouldn't be happening in Mauritius, so they had to go to France, to England, and to other countries like that to be recognized as writers, to be able to live as writers. And so we had a lot of literature that was kind of looking back at the island like something dreamed and a bit over, I don't find the word in English.
Romanticized?
Yeah, in a way, that's it. But then we have a generation now of writers who live in Mauritius and who talk about Mauritius in a very different way. We have writers, a generation of writers who are published mostly in France. I have a friend, a writer called Natasha Apana. Her latest novel, called Tropique de la Violence, was in line for the 3 most prestigious French prizes a few weeks back, the Prix Goncourt, Prix Renaudot, Prix Médicis. And it's interesting to note that at the same time as there is the great vitality of our writers, we are not read in our own country. We are read elsewhere around the world and studied around the world, but not in our country, because I think that Mauritians in a way have a problem with what we tell and say in our literature. When my second book came out, it's called Sensitive, and it was published in France. So the news first came out in the newspapers that I was having a book published in France by a great publisher. And so people came up to me saying, wow, we're proud, that's great. And I said, what are we proud of? But we're an ancient colony, so there's still that saying, well, if it's published over there, it must be good, it must be great. And I said, if it was published in Mauritius, I would have been writing exactly the same book, but never mind. But then the book came out. People started reading it, and that's where the problem started. I was approached by a lady once in a bookstore when I was doing a book signing, and she was very angry and she was very aggressive, and she told me, why did you have to go and tell these things about us in France? Because the image of Mauritius that I gave in my book didn't fit at all with the postcard image that we have. We're a tropical country, a very touristic country. We like being told we're the best, we're the number one, we're beautiful, we're great. And we don't like anything going against that image. And we, contemporary writers, are not writing the postcard. I don't mean to say we're writing against the postcard, but what we're telling doesn't quite go across with the official image. And so I told this lady, well, I'm not here to do the promotion of Mauritius. There are people who are paid for that at the tourist office, and they do a very good job, and that's not my job as a writer. But I think we're in very much a culture of representation, and that's as much linked to our colonial past as to our touristic present, where we don't like things to go against the official image. And that's where we writers are a bit not going on with the tune, so, but that's the way it is.
Do you have a favorite Mauritian writer other than yourself?
Natasha Arpana is a great writer. I encourage all of you to read her books. She has a book that has been translated in English that's called The Lost Brother. And it tells the story of, at one time when the Jews were leaving Europe to go to Palestine during the Second World War, a boat was anchored by the British, and there were 1,000, a little over 1,000 Jews that were sent to Mauritius. And so this book tells the encounter between a young Mauritian boy who has lost his brothers in a cyclone, and a young Jewish boy who is imprisoned in Mauritius. And it's a beautiful book, and it's called The Lost Brother. There is also an author called Ananda Devi, which is a powerful, really powerful writer. Carl de Souza also is a great writer for me. He wrote a beautiful book called La Maison qui marchait vers le large. It's called, in English, it's The House That Walked Towards the Sea. And it tells a lot about the inter-ethnic relationships in Mauritius, and it's really a very interesting and beautiful book.
I believe I met Ananda Devi. She was at the Penn Faulkner Africa celebration last year in New York. Yeah. So
she's a very, very powerful writer.
It would be great if we could get her, be the second Mauritian writer. So tell me about your literary journal that you founded. Is it still published? And why did you create the magazine?
I see that you've been doing a lot of homework.
Journalist.
Yes. We published a few years back. I was kind of fed up of always, people complaining, saying, well, people don't read, we don't have a reading culture, people don't buy books, people don't read, and always like sitting there whining and complaining. And I said, why don't we just try to do something about it? We have very few bookstores in Mauritius. They are located only in the 5 main cities. And it's always the same people who cross the step of a bookstore. A lot of people don't go to a bookstore because they feel like it's not for them. Whereas I think literature should be for everybody because it has something to tell and exchange with every one of us. And so with a group of friends, writers, we sat down and we said, why don't we try to do something and launch a literary journal with contemporary writers. But the specificity of it is that we wanted to have it going all over the island to all those people who don't usually read books. And the best way to do that, I was working in a newspaper, so I thought the distribution network of the newspapers is very effective. It goes through 800 different places throughout Mauritius and everywhere. And so we said, why don't we just try to make that thing printed on newsprint and inserted in a newspaper and distributed over the 800 and more selling points throughout Mauritius. And it was a great experience because I went out on the first day it went out, and I went to different places, and I went into that small shop where there were construction workers working on a construction site just on the other side, and at midday for their break they came in the shop to buy a sandwich or something, and they saw the journal on the table there, and they started flipping through it and laughing about things they read and asking themselves things about things they read. And that was a very interesting thing because I think it was a way of putting literature in the hands of people who perhaps wouldn't normally go to it. But that ended very quickly because unfortunately some people are a bit narrow-minded, I have to say. Some of us participating in that journal were working for another newspaper, which was in a way concurrent of the one who distributed us, and so there was a fight between those two newspapers, which is so stupid. but then it ended, but I still think about launching that again, about working on it again, and one of my other dreams is also to have a bibliobus going throughout the island and bringing books everywhere to a lot of children who don't have access to books. So it's still an ongoing dream.
So you have a librarian's dream.
Yes, I do.
That's very interesting, because I was the editor of an inserted magazine in a newspaper as well.
Okay.
So I'm beginning to think
So
that,
we have a lot of
yes,
common.
I think so. You translated Tintin books into Mauritian Creole. Why did you choose those works, and how were they received? Because as you know, that in contemporary times, some find Tintin to be controversial, or more specifically, racist.
I'll start answering that.
Can you use the mic?
I think my mic is not working anymore. Thank you.
I'll start answering that by talking about Creole, which is something that is very important to me. Creole is the local language that was born out of terrible violence of history. We had French colonizers who brought in slaves from different parts of Africa to work in the sugarcane fields. And at one point they had to find a way to communicate, so that's how Creole emerged from a very, very difficult and very violent period of our history, but it's fascinating to see how people can create out of that something that is very lively and creative, which Creole language is to me. More than 90% of people in Mauritius speak Creole, but for long it has been considered as another language, as a patois. It has been looked down, it has been really ill-treated, which shouldn't be, because it's the mother tongue of most of us. But we have those prestige languages like French and English, which people think so important, and there's always that kind of quarrel between one language and the other, which shouldn't be. I mean, we can have different languages and international languages and our local languages also. The result of that is that we had children growing up in Creole language, and then at 5 going to school and being taught everything in a language which was totally foreign to them, which is English. So they went to school and they were taught history and mathematics and everything in English, which amounts to here children in America going to school and being taught everything in, I don't know, Portuguese or something like that. The result is that for a long time, 50% of our children were left out of school at the end of the primary cycle. So around 10, they were thrown out of school, and it's a terrible thing for a country. But for a long time, it was correct to do it in a way, because we were a very labor-intensive economy with the sugarcane plantations. But now this has changed, and we need more people who are educated. And so there has been a big fight for Creole to be recognized as a language and to go into our schools. And I think that we as writers have a great responsibility towards that fight. It was important for us to translate a lot. I had a friend who translated all of Shakespeare's plays in Creole as a way of showing that, well, Creole can express, is a language as any other, is as valuable a language as English or French. We translated a lot, we created a lot in Creole, and the result is that nowadays, well, 2 years ago, Creole has been introduced in our schools, and I think that's a very great step for our country and for the children of our country. So translating Tintin, I translated, for example, Beckett's Waiting for Godot in Creole, which is such a lot of complexity even in its original language. And it was like, one time I was like taking my hair out, saying, why did you have to go into such a thing? Because it was very difficult, it was really a challenge. Translating Tintin went in that same line, because Tintin is a very famous comic that was created in Belgium by Hergé and has been translated in over more than 100 languages, and it's very popular in Mauritius and in a lot of countries. And translating it in Creole was a way of making it exist, making our language exist beside all those great languages. The second aspect is that, yes, Tintin is controversial in some ways. For example, Tintin in Congo is said to be racist, and some people have tried to have it interdicted, and I'm totally against that. I think it goes against my freedom of knowing. Tintin for me is interesting because it tells about a period of time and how people reacted and fought at that period. Hergé is a product of his time, and in a way he was reacting and creating in conformity with that period. He wrote another Tintin which goes about Tintin and the Soviets, which went along with the preoccupations at the moment in the world about the Soviets. He wrote a book, another comic about men walking on the moon. So it all goes with what was in people's mind and in a certain section of people's mind at that time. And for me that's interesting. I think I have a right to know that. It helps me understand in the same way as I'm trying to understand at the moment what is going on in the minds and hearts of a number of American people. And I wouldn't like to be some things to be taken out or off by people who decide for me what I have a right to read and learn and have access to. And I think reading Tintin is interesting to get in contact with what certain people were thinking at that time about their prejudices, about all of that. So it's also interesting to me. And I don't believe in censorship in that way, because I think it would deprive me of the right to take the scope of all of it and then make my own opinion and decision.
Well, I hope that at the end of September you were able to celebrate Banned Books Week, in which you take every book that's ever been maligned and you publicize it and celebrate it, and everything that's considered bad about it becomes good. But I'd like you to translate Asterix Le Gaulois.
Yes, one day, I hope so, yes.
Yeah, it sounds like that. Did that?
Again.
It went out again? Okay. All right, so let me ask my question.
They're getting tired, I think.
I think so. Let me ask my question. I'll pass the microphone to you. This is the last question. How do you see the future for African and African diaspora writers? And what steps need to be taken to broaden the readership of African literature in the international community?
This is a big question. I think we have a problem first with our own image. I think we don't think enough of ourselves and what we create most of the time, because we feel like it must come from America or England or France or things like that to be interesting. One of the big challenges, I think, would be to be able to create publishing houses throughout Africa that would have a good network of distribution throughout the world, because even between African countries we don't get to read our own books. We don't get South African books in Mauritius unless they go through a publishing house in New York or elsewhere. And I think that's where we must try, the same way as we created Tracé, to take things in our own hands and stop waiting for international publishers to become interested in what we are writing and what we are doing. So that's a good job that I think we have. An interesting time ahead of us to really try to put to the world what we are writing, what we are creating, our very own voices, and not try to please a publisher based in New York or in England or in France who's going to tell us, well, you have to write along these lines or along this current to be able to sell, because I think our voices and our stories have their own way of telling things, have their own way, have their own preoccupations, and we were having this ongoing discussion about what is universal or not, and I think that's a strange way of putting things, that we should, when writing, thinking how universal am I, being Steinbeck wrote all his life from his small camping village, and he's so universal because when you speak about the human being, in a way, you're universal anyway, so we shouldn't be afraid to be telling stories coming from our countries and our realities and with our very own voices, which might differ from the international trends of the moment. But to be able to do that, we have to give ourselves the means of being published and being distributed. And that's a great challenge, and I think that at a political level it should be campaigned, and because the cultural aspect most of the time is left out, and we should call our politicians and ruling people to account on that aspect also, because it's as much as economics or any other thing, culture, literature, creating is such an important part of who we are.
Before I open it up, I just wanted to make a very small aside. It might be something that came from another dimension, but today, had my father lived, he would have been 92 years old. C. Clyde Ferguson Jr., he was the first Black ambassador to Uganda, and it was from Uganda that I traveled to Mauritius. And so somehow, I feel like somehow he probably said, hey, on my birthday, I'm going to get you all together because you have a lot in common, more than just sharing the microphone. At this point, I would like to open up to the audience. I'm going to let Anya figure out how to do that for questions. And of course, I want to say thank you to Shenaz for what was just an incredibly informative conversation.
Thanks to you. Thank you very much.
So we'll open it up for questions. I'll come to you with the mic and then bring the mic back to Shenaz, so be patient with our mics. Anyone? Just takes one.
I'm curious, you use the expression that Francophone literature is, it's more, there's more freedom for you in Anglophone literature than there is, and I just wondered, what does that do when you write? I know you just started writing in English. Does your writing change? What about the writing process changes for you when you write in English as opposed to French?
I don't know yet if I'm writing in English. It's too early to say, I think. But one thing I've noticed since I'm here is I was very self-conscious at first about talking English, about speaking English, because I'm not used to speaking English. I speak French and Creole, and my English is kind of a bit rusty. And I said I felt like there's this sculpture from Salvador Dali, which is called The Woman with Drawers. And I feel like that when I speak English. I feel like I'm talking to someone, and at the same time I'm looking for a word, and I'm opening all the drawers frantically, trying to find the right word, and it's not coming out at that moment. So I have to find another way around to try to say things, and it can be very frustrating because you feel like you're not getting across exactly what you want to say. And you sometimes feel like it seems stupid or not accurate to what you want to say. So it's a kind of negotiation all the time with what you want to say and how it gets across on the spot. Writing is easier because then you have time to go and look for the word, which you don't have in conversation. But it's also linked to why I write, I think, because in real life I'm not very... People have that talent sometimes of being able to interact and kind of ping-pong in a conversation, and very often I find myself like 5 minutes afterwards I said, oh, that's what I wanted to say, but then you can't run after the person and say, come back, that's what I wanted to say to you. In writing you can, so that's nice. What I found here is that Anglophone people are not that how would I say that? They don't hold you to account to the purity of the language in a way, as much as French people do. In French, when you don't speak French correctly, you feel much more awkward about it because there's an academy which sets the standards, and people are much more precise about it. And whereas in English, I feel like there are so many Englishes, and you are so much more free with it. When I read the book, we were talking about it with Martin Priya here, who's from South Africa. We are awaiting in great excitement for Arundhati Roy's next book, which is due next year. When I read The God of Small Things, which is this wonderful book, it was such a revelation to me that you could write English that way, because she just takes English words and she conjugates them or turns them into Indian way of speaking, and she just feels so free with that. In French literature, you have a writer called Patrick Chamoiseau, who wrote a book, who's from the Martinique, I think, who wrote a book called Texaco, and he got the Prix Goncourt for another few years back, and people were exclaiming about how he was enriching French language and being kind of bringing Creole structures and Creole words into French, and it was like a great thing, whereas in English it is done all the time. So I feel like there's much more freedom there, and writing literature for me is so much about creating language also, because we are so often confronted with, even when writing in our own language, with how words are inadequate sometimes, how the words we have, the words that exist, the words that we have at hand, are not sufficient, are not adequate enough to tell what we want to tell. And so we feel like creating new words or trying to find other ways of telling the stories. And at the moment, I really feel like in English there's more space for that. So I'll have to reflect on that and see what I'm going to do afterwards. If I'm going to claim that freedom in English or trying to impose it in French, because then writing, it depends the objective of your writing. If you write for yourself, I write a lot for myself. My drawers are full of things that I know I'll never send to a publisher because I know it won't get published. It's not in the current of the moment or things like that. But then at one point, if you want to be published, your publisher is going to tell you, well, that's not in the trend of things, so what do you change, what do you not accept? It's very not easy. But I really feel like in Anglophone publishing, there's much more vitality at the moment.
Thank you very much. I mean, that was a wonderful, wonderful presentation, and I loved your reading as well. I wanted to ask you, and perhaps in a way you suggested it, are there particular themes, especially, and it's a bit a follow-up to what you just said, are there particular themes that you would like to write about, that you may have already written about, or that you are hesitant to write about? But are there certain themes in your writing that you would like, as you're looking into the future, to write about?
I usually say that I don't write about themes. I don't think I'm a writer with messages. I write a story. Very often it starts with a sentence. I have a sentence walking in my head for days and weeks and sometimes months, and I don't know why, but it's there. It's there for a reason, obviously. I think a lot of people have told me that I write very social novels or things like that. I know there's something that goes through it, and why do we write? Why do we sit down at one point in front of a computer or a blank page instead of going out, having fun, walking, swimming, anything? It's because I think at one point we feel an urge that is very deep to say, to tell something. Why I'm not quite sure, and I'm not quite sure I want to know. I feel in a way I'm afraid of knowing too much and losing the desire to write, yes. Looks like this one is really getting tired of it. Our speaker. It's just that it's a mystery for me. How it happens, why it happens. Can you use this? No, it's not working. It doesn't.
On the
matter.
podium?
On the podium.
That mic works.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Okay.
It's a very mysterious thing for me, and I like it that way. I don't quite know how it happens, why it happens. For me, it's like I have a very sweet tooth also. I like eating, and I like comparing writing to that cake, that multi-layered cake, or that we call a millefeuille in French. Things happen to us every day. We walk and we overhear a conversation, and someone makes a confidence to us, and we see a film, we hear music, we get a feeling of something, and all these kinds of piles up like that. Well, at least that's the process for me, until at one time it gets quite concrete, and I feel like there's a story there that's taking shape. And the precise moment for me that it becomes writing, because I write a lot in my head, I walk around and I write stories in my head. And then there's one particular point when I'm reading, and I feel like, on the TV screen when there are something interfering with the image, I feel exactly like that. I'm reading, and I have the characters in my head who are talking to the characters in the book, and it's like, and then I say, no, you stop, you put the book down, you write what you have to write. But it's a very, very mysterious process. I don't know, I don't wake up one morning and say, okay, today I'm going to write a novel about abused women or violence against children or things like that. But it's there, it's in the writing. And it's in all that I live, it's in all that makes me react, it's in all my fears, it's in all my doubts. I think I write a lot because I'm not satisfied with the world as it is. I write a lot with what I don't understand, and that's the only thing I know.
And I believe since the mics have died, that perhaps this concludes
They're
our
gonna
program. I did just want to say that in kind of dovetailing on what you said, I saw a T-shirt about 2 days ago that said, "English is difficult, but it can be understood through thorough thought," though, which is a little bit of alliteration there, with the same letters, and so English. As a former English professor, it is difficult, but it does have many nuances and facets. And French, well, when you speak to French people and you don't do it right, they don't understand you.
That's true.
But if there are no more questions, can we once again thank Shenaz Patel for her presentation and her presence here, and invite you to come back November 18th for the Ghanaian writer Kwame Dawes, who will be in conversation with the area specialist Angel Batiste. We hope you will return. We may have a December surprise, maybe. But I want to thank you for coming this afternoon, and encourage you to read more African literature. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.